A German shepherd emerged from the shadows of the scrapyard, his coat marked by scars and his gaze lit with unwavering loyalty. For years, he had stood watch in silence, but tonight the echo of an old locomotive's bell would awaken a secret hidden in steel. Behind the rusting frame of Blue Star 314, forgotten promises waited, while greedy men circled like wolves. No one believed the dog would hold his ground. No one thought a worn-out Marine would risk everything for a vow he had never made. What unfolded next would break hearts and prove that even rust can guard a miracle. Before we dive in, tell me where you're watching from. Drop your country in the comments. And if you believe that no soul, no promise, and no faithful companion should ever be abandoned, hit subscribe, because this story may just restore your faith in second chances. Morning crept in quietly. A pale line of light stretched itself over the blue ridge, brushing frost across the rail yard as though the day were trying to remember its own beginning. The air carried the mingled scents of iron, wet leaves, and last night's rain. A northern wind slipped through the chain-link fence of Delaney salvage and made it ring like a faint bell. Reed Ashford stood there, hands in the torn pockets of a jacket that had seen too many winters. He measured the morning with the patience of a man who had learned to wait. 36 years old, lean not from gyms but from long miles, his dark hair was kept short out of habit, his beard trimmed more from discipline than vanity. His face bore the stubborn geometry of someone who carried grief without flaunting it. A faint scar traced along his jaw, evidence of some shard once seeking a home. The fine creases at his eyes came not from laughter but from long watches. Reed moved like a coiled spring, compact, quiet, always ready, even here among the carcasses of machines long forgotten. The Marines had left him with a back that woke early, shoulders that remembered weight, and a restless scan of every horizon. What they had taken from him, he never put into words. In his pocket he carried a small notebook, his father's, filled with careful, looping notes of a mechanic who believed in torque specs, pencil lines, and the principle that a man earns by keeping things running. Somewhere in those pages was a mention of Blue Star, a promise in steel. At Reed's side sat Vesper, his 4-year-old German shepherd. His sable coat carried 3 shades of earth, like a fading sunset. One ear tipped slightly from an old puppyhood scrape, giving him an air of constant curiosity. His amber-brown eyes held the calm depth of winter tea. Balanced, rangy, carved more than grown, he moved with the silence of a shadow but could strike forward like an arrow when called. Vesper knew Reed's moods the way dogs memorize homes, through scent, routine, and love. When Reed's breath tightened, Vesper leaned in just a little. When the wind carried the faint taste of metal, Vesper lifted his nose, writing invisible notes in the air. Delaney salvage looked like a museum that had lost its labels, a forest of axles, a plain of hoodless cars, turbine blades huddled beneath stained tarps. At the end of 50 feet of abandoned track, railroad bones that refused to sink, rested Blue Star 314. The locomotive stood rusted and solemn, black paint peeling into freckles, the faded numbers ghosting along her side. The stenciled star cracked, faint but still recognizable. She had the posture of an aging prizefighter, chin tucked, shoulders squared, daring the years to try again. She no longer smelled of movement. She smelled of the memory of it. "Steel remembers," said a gravelly voice. Gus Delaney crossed the yard with the rolling gait of a man who knew where every nail lived. 68, built square and solid despite a bad shoulder, he wore denim on denim and a cap that once read Roanoke Repairs. His hands were walnut brown, etched with scars from decades of choosing to make bolts yield before knuckles did. His broad face was anchored by a half-smile that wavered somewhere between patience and skepticism. His eyes, pale blue, carried the habit of people who look closely at things others overlook. He coughed often but ignored it, and he spoke to machines as though they were stubborn cousins. "You wake a thing like this," he said, resting a palm on the side of the locomotive, "she'll tell you where she's been." "I don't need her to run," Reed answered. He heard how the words sounded and let them stand. "I just need her to remember." Gus chuckled. "Then you came to the right church." Vesper circled the front truck, nose low, tail steady, tracing invisible triangles as he inspected flange, hanger, and the line where the boiler belly met the walkway. He stopped at a panel near the engineer's side, sniffed, and let out one soft bark, a restrained sound, almost like a librarian clearing her throat. The panel had been painted more recently, or maybe it was simply trying too hard not to be interesting. "Aha," Gus murmured, as if the dog had just confirmed a suspicion. A dog knows when a wall is really a door. He tapped the panel and tilted his head at the hollow echo. On paper, the deal should have felt monumental. In practice, it was a scarred desk, a pen, and a number that made Reed's stomach turn cold. $3,000, the last tidy stack from an account that had been shrinking with quiet dignity. He slid the bills across the counter. The woman behind the glass counted them with the indifference of someone removing stitches. Outside, a crow perched on a rail and looked entertained. Word spread fast, as it always did in Roanoke. By the time Reed stepped back into the pale sunlight, two men, faces smudged with drywall dust and coffee stains, were already leaning against the fence. $3,000, one said, round-bellied in a camo jacket that had never seen the field. He lifted his chin in a mix of pity and mockery. For a lawn ornament. The other laughed, the sound like lids rattling on a boiling pot. Could have bought a car that actually moves. They weren't cruel, just comfortable. People loved narrating other people's mistakes. Reed didn't feel any need to correct them. He had learned long ago to let such things pass by, like trains: you watch, you count, you don't try to catch them. From the street came the soft squeal of brakes, like a violin bow hesitating. A compact hatchback coasted to a stop. Out stepped May Whitcomb, 53, small as a typewriter and dressed like a fog bank. Her gray cardigan hung neatly over a navy skirt, and her shoes looked as though they had been chosen for one job and were determined to do it. Her hair, cut in a practical bob, was the color of river stone. Her face carried the kind of plain openness that made children blurt the truth. The heavy frames of her glasses didn't apologize for their thickness. May was head librarian at the Gainsborough branch. She filed romances beside city blueprints and had strong opinions about both. The daughter of a railway signalman, trains were her second language. She pronounced Baldwin with the reverence of a love song. She set a pink bakery box on the hood of her car and lifted the lid. A perfume of sugar and yeast drifted out, wrapping the cold air. Diplomatic provisions, she declared, for the treaty between doubt and possibility. Vesper's ears rose like curtains on a stage. He sat politely, though his muscles trembled with eagerness. "Permission to confiscate," May said, deadpan, holding out a glazed ring. Vesper took it with monk-like solemnity, carried it to Reed, and conducted a thorough inspection: nose, whiskers, a quick crunch. In the middle of chewing, he made a noise like water sliding into a gutter. Both Gus and May laughed, the sound unfastening the afternoon. Even the men at the fence softened. "You're really going through with it," May said, her voice quieter now. Her eyes flicked from Reed to the locomotive. Reed nodded. "My father kept notes. Little things, how a certain shim fit, which valve whined in winter. I found a line once about Blue Star. Not many words, but it read like something he didn't want to lose. He didn't mention the rest. How his father had written a letter in the same hand on the day Reed shipped out, a letter that said, 'Guard what the world puts in your hands. Return what doesn't belong to you.' Some words were meant for one reader only." By afternoon, the paperwork was finished. The yard grew quieter as the sun dulled to pewter. Gus showed Reed where the temporary track met the cradle, which Vesper's ears rose like curtains on a stage. He sat politely, though his muscles trembled with eagerness. "Permission to confiscate," May said, deadpan, holding out a glazed ring. Vesper took it with monk-like solemnity, carried it to Reed, and conducted a thorough inspection: nose, whiskers, a quick crunch. In the middle of chewing, he made a noise like water sliding into a gutter. Both Gus and May laughed, the sound unfastening the afternoon. Even the men at the fence softened. "You're really going through with it," May said, her voice quieter now. Her eyes flicked from Reed to the locomotive. Reed nodded. "My father kept notes. Little things, how a certain shim fit, which valve whined in winter. I found a line once about blue." He placed the thermos between his boots and opened his father's notebook. The leather creaked as if whispering, "Careful, boy." Notes and fragments filled the page: blue star, good steel in her bones, hollow panel, engineer's side. Then a single puzzling line, cedar behind the paint. Why cedar? A smudge followed, as if a thumb had paused, then changed its mind. The wind climbed into a low continuous hum, and sheet metal answered with its tired falsetto. A stray dog barked somewhere down the line, thought better, and silenced itself. Vesper rose, circled once, and settled with a sigh, not of weariness, but of readiness. For a long while, nothing happened. The world is a patient book, it is we who are impatient readers. Then, something. A shift so small it could be missed. Vesper's head tilted 3 degrees toward the panel he had marked earlier. He sniffed once, then again, then patted over. He placed a paw on the riveted seam and looked back at Reed the way a partner might lift an eyebrow at a crime scene. "What is it?" Reed asked, just to break the silence. Vesper didn't answer with sound. He scratched once. The rivet gave a reluctant shiver, like a loose tooth. He scratched again, harder, and the rivet trembled. Reed set the notebook aside, crouched, and pressed his ear to the panel. The steel was cold, but behind it came a faint hollow echo where no space should exist. His instincts lit up, the weight of a socket set in hand, the memory of a stubborn bolt, the feel of steel resisting before it yields. He tapped along the line, solid, solid, hollow, solid, hollow. Like stepping stones across a forgotten stream. "There you are," he whispered, not to the metal, but to the secret inside it. Vesper's tail swept once in quiet satisfaction. Reed rested his palm on the painted steel as some men press a hand on a Bible before swearing an oath. He felt the faint vibration of wind and the memory of 1,000 miles, but for the first time all day it didn't sound like a dare, it sounded like an invitation. Gus had said steel remembers. So do suns. He hadn't come here to make 314 run. But something inside her had stirred anyway. A hollow note in the ribs of a sleeping giant. Reed lifted his head and met Vesper's knowing eyes. "Tomorrow," he whispered. "We open it tomorrow." The wind folded the word into the scrapyard's old song, and night draped itself like a promise. The next morning arrived without spectacle. The sky over Roanoke was a washed-out gray, mist clinging to the yard's edges as if reluctant to leave. Reed rose stiffly from the cab of the locomotive, every joint echoing the night spent on cold steel. His thermos was nearly empty, the coffee inside long gone. Beside him, Vesper stretched in the deliberate way German shepherds do, shaking dew from his sable coat. His eyes already scanned the shadows, as if watch duty had been written into his blood. Before heading back to the salvage yard, Reed stopped by his apartment, a bare one-bedroom that leaned more toward survival than comfort. The walls were blank, the cot plain, a few books stacked instead of shelved. At the foot of the bed sat a cedar chest, brass corners tarnished with age. To open it was to lift a curtain between past and present. The smell of cedar and oilcloth poured out, carrying with it his father's silence. Inside lay the relics of a man who believed more in work than words, wrenches smoothed by years of palms, a compass with initials etched in brass, and, wrapped in ragged cloth, a small iron oil lamp, its handle polished by long use. Reed held it carefully. He remembered his father carrying this lamp into the barn during storms, turning chores into ritual under its yellow glow. There was more. A steel caliper, still sharp at its hinge. And tucked in a notebook sleeve, a slip of thin silver foil. On it, in his father's looping script, sanctuary line. Blue star. Engineer's chair. False wall. The handwriting shook Reed more than the words. His father, who never indulged riddles, had written this with deliberate secrecy. It felt like being handed a map that pointed both outward and inward. Vesper nudged his hand, urging him not to drown in memory. Reed scratched the dog's bent ear, then struck a match. The lamp caught with a tired sigh, casting warm amber light that pressed the mist back. Reed sat cross-legged, staring at the phrase sanctuary line. It sounded less like a train route and more like a covenant. Heat rose in his chest, memory turning to ache. Another time, another desert. Sand had baked his skin even through fatigues, the air thick with gunpowder. A convoy ambushed at a crossroads. Morales falling, eyes wide with disbelief, blood darkening the sand like ink. Reed pressing his hand over the wound, whispering promises he couldn't keep. Later, beneath stars sharp as glass, he had stared at his hands, wondering if they would ever feel clean again. The memory clawed him even now. His chest tightened. Then Vesper pressed his muzzle against Reed's wrist, steady pressure pulling him back to the present. Reed let out a ragged breath and whispered, "Good boy. Better medicine than the VA ever was." By afternoon the sky dimmed with the threat of rain. Back at Delaney Salvage, Gus grumbled over a tractor tire, his hands stiff with arthritis but still sure. He offered Reed no questions, only a nod toward the 314, as though saying, "Whatever's inside, make it worth it." Reed climbed into the cab. Vesper leapt up behind him with practiced grace. The lamp glowed again, its fat flame casting shadows across riveted steel. Reed crouched by the engineer's seat, running his fingers along the wall. At first, just metal, cold and unyielding. Then, there. A hollow shift in tone when his knuckles tapped. The paint bore tiny arcs, scratches that looked less like accident and more like handwriting erased. His father's note echoed in his mind, "False wall." Reed's pulse quickened. He pulled a screwdriver from his satchel and tested the seam. With a screech like a reluctant hinge, the panel began to give way, rust flaking in protest. His breath went shallow. At last, the plate loosened, revealing a cavity. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth darkened by decades, lay a bundle. A faint breath of cedar escaped as though time itself had been trapped there. Reed's hands trembled as he unwrapped it. The cloth crumbled at the edges, but within lay a ledger stamped with a faded seal and a stack of yellowed papers. Lists, typed neatly, annotated in careful pen. At the top of one page, in still legible black ink, Hollow Creek Relief Train, 1937. The names followed in columns. Goldstein family, trunk. Carter family, chest, quilt, Bible. Alvarez, violin, case. Dozens more. At the bottom, in smaller script, to be returned when safe. Property of survivors of the Appalachian flood. Reed's throat closed. This was no salvage. This was memory hidden away, waiting for hands that might never return. The flame of the lamp glowed against the page. Vesper whined softly, sensing the shift in his master's breath. "My father knew," Reed whispered. "He knew this was here." Rain began pattering softly on the cab roof, like the sky itself was exhaling. The following day, rain lingered, turning the streets of Roanoke into dark mirrors. Reed carried the fragile bundle back to the yard. May met him at the office, her umbrella striped green and white, her satchel stuffed with clippings that jutted out like wild bookmarks. She was the kind of woman who hoarded history the way others hoarded stamps. "I couldn't sleep either," she admitted, pulling out microfilm prints. "Remember the flood of '37? Hollow Creek, Mudford, whole valleys underwater. The Roanoke Times reported a relief train, the Blue Star Line." She spread the papers on a crate. Families had signed temporary custody of their belongings to the railway for safekeeping, Bibles, quilts, jewelry, trusting they would be returned when homes were rebuilt. But most of those items never came back, May said. Records lost. Warehouses collapsed. It became one of those quiet tragedies people stopped talking about. Reed traced faded photographs, families knee-deep in mud, women clutching children, men holding nothing at all. The Blue Star engine stood in the background, its number faint but visible. Vesper sniffed the damp pages, sneezed, then wagged his tail as though confirming their truth. That afternoon they drove to the Roanoke History Annex, a sandstone building with carved lintels and tall windows. Inside, the air smelled of dust, ink, and the mildew archivists fought but never conquered. Dr. Eliza Thornton appeared from the stacks, a tall woman in her 40s with a braid that revealed streaks of early gray. Her black dress and wool jacket gave her a strict silhouette, but her eyes were sharp rather than cold. Years earlier, she had nearly lost her career exposing a forged museum donation. Since then, she trusted only evidence. She sat with Reed's bundle, slipping on gloves before examining it. "This is what kept you awake?" she asked. Her voice carried the clipped cadence of a professor, but her gaze betrayed the vigilance of someone who had been burned before. "These initials, J.T. Harris. He was Blue Star's conductor in 37. Look, his signature matches payroll rosters." She studied the ink, the fibers, the oxidation. "This ledger is authentic." Reed let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Eliza's gray eyes flicked up. "Where did you find it?" "In the cab. Behind the engineer's seat." That seemed to satisfy her. She closed the ledger gently. Engines carried more than steam. Sometimes they carried secrets. Vaults on wheels. Back at the yard, the rain thickened into a steady sheet. Gus Delaney lumbered into the cab of the 314, his coveralls stained darker by the damp, a wrench sticking out of his pocket. He squinted at the riveted walls Reed had already disturbed, tracing the seams with a thumb as though reading Braille. "This girl's built different," he muttered. He tapped a section of piping. "See here. Auxiliary brake system. Extra feed line. Not standard issue. She could cut a car loose mid-run and no one would know unless they were listening for it." He grunted. Somebody designed her for discretion. Vesper prowled restlessly, his nose pressed against seams, his tail twitching through the damp air. Then he froze, ears sharp. With a short bark, he pressed his nose against another section of boiler casing. The smell of cedar lingered beneath the rust, faint but undeniable. Reed crouched beside him, pressing his palm to the metal. The vibration felt different, less solid, more alive. His pulse tightened. With Gus's help, he wedged a pry bar into the seam. Rust cracked loose, flaking like old bark. The panel shifted, then gave. Inside was a narrow recess, carefully packed. Reed pulled out a bundle tied with twine. His hands shook as he unwrapped it. A map, ink faded to sepia, sprawled with rail lines cutting across the Blue Ridge valleys. Small crosses dotted the map, each marked with initials. Tucked alongside was another ledger, its cover labeled in fountain pen, Sanctuary Line. Reed flipped through its pages. Names, objects, notes. Family Bible, will claim. Silver ring, no claimant. Quilt, waiting. At the bottom of one page, a name stood out, circled once in heavy ink, Miller's Gap. May's voice dropped to a whisper. Sanctuary Line. It wasn't just a route. It was a promise, to keep what couldn't be carried through the flood. Eliza's gloved hands closed the ledger with almost reverent care. Her expression hardened, her voice precise. This isn't salvage. This is restitution. A record of trust waiting to be honored. Reed laid a hand on Vesper's head. The dog's steady warmth bled into his palm. Then we answer it. Outside, the rain hammered harder, as if to mark the vow. By the time the storm cleared, whispers had already spread through Roanoke. The salvage yard, usually a graveyard of machines, buzzed with rumor. People said Reed Ashford was sleeping inside the Blue Star 314. Others swore they'd seen him smuggling old papers under his coat. In a town that thrived on gossip, stories grew quickly. And whispers have a way of reaching the wrong ears. That afternoon, a black sedan rolled into Delaney Salvage, engine purring low. The driver stepped out with the deliberate confidence of a man accustomed to pricing other people's memories. Harland Crow. Late 40s, tall and wiry, his shoulders narrow as if stress had carved them. His black hair slicked back in neat lines, thinning at the crown. His suit was too fine for the mud he stepped through. His pale gray eyes didn't look so much as measure, and his thin smile cut like a blade too close to the skin. Years earlier, he had inherited a failing antique shop from his uncle. Instead of saving it honestly, he'd turned to acquisitions that blurred the line between salvage and theft. Reputation called him a heritage dealer. Others called him a scavenger. "Mr. Ashford," he said smoothly. "I hear you've stumbled onto something significant." Reed stood by the locomotive, hands deep in his jacket pockets. At his heel, Vesper stiffened, hackles rising the way they did when coyotes shadowed the fence line. Harland circled the engine slowly, his eyes scanning rivets and seams. "These ledgers, these relics, they're valuable. Families are gone. Collectors will pay. I can make you a generous offer. Cash. No questions." Reed's jaw tightened. "They're not for sale." Vesper stepped forward, planting himself between Harland and the locomotive, his body rigid, growl resonating low and dangerous. Each time Harland shifted closer, Vesper shifted too, blocking the path with an authority no man could fake. May arrived just in time, umbrella tucked under one arm, tote bag stuffed with papers. She might not have been tall, but she had librarian steel behind her gentle smile. "Mr. Crow," she said evenly. "If you think you can walk in here and spirit away history, you're mistaken." Harland smirked, unfazed. He slid a business card onto a rail tie. "Consider it. But don't take too long. Others are interested." Then he turned and walked away, his shoes leaving shallow prints in the mud. That evening, May summoned her circle, the Roanoke Senior Heritage Group, a patchwork of retired teachers, amateur genealogists, and hobby historians. They arrived with phones and cameras, documenting every inch of the Blue Star 314. Photos uploaded to shared drives, notes pinned to church boards, whispers spread across the community. If anything happened to the locomotive or its ledgers, there would be witnesses. Dr. Eliza Thornton made her own discreet call. From her office at the History Annex, she dialed a colleague at the State Department of Historic Resources. Her tone clipped, controlled. Evidence of lost cultural property had surfaced. It might require state protection. She revealed no excitement, her scars from past betrayals taught her that every truth must be shielded until it could stand alone. By nightfall, the yard was quiet again. Reed lit the lamp inside the cab, the flame dancing across the steel. Vesper lay at the doorway, ears twitching with every sound. Reed leaned back, exhaustion in his bones, the ledger open on his lap. He almost drifted when a sound sliced the silence. Metal groaned, not with wind, but with pressure. Reed froze, listening. Vesper snapped upright, teeth bared, growl rolling like distant thunder. Reed grabbed the lamp, crouched near the panel he had opened. Fresh tool marks glistened silver against the rust. Someone had tried to pry it open. On the ground lay a torn leather glove, punctured deep with unmistakable bite marks. Reed lifted it into the lamplight, its damp leather carrying a faint smell of cologne and sweat. "They know," he murmured. "And they'll come back." Vesper pressed close, eyes locked on the dark beyond the fence. The hollow inside the locomotive was no longer a curiosity. It was a vault under siege. The following morning dawned with the scrapyard wrapped in mist, the kind that clung to steel as though reluctant to let go. Reed climbed back into the cab of the Blue Star 314, lamp in hand, Vesper at his side. The dog's coat shimmered with dew, every movement taut with alertness. Both man and dog knew someone had tampered with the hidden panel overnight. Reed set the lamp on the floor and crouched near the firebox. The soot-stained metal yawned cold and hollow. He ran his hand along the rivets until one section replied with a different note, hollow, almost like a drum. "Let's see what else you're hiding," he muttered. With Gus's worn pry bar, he teased open the seam. Rust flaked away in slow protest. Behind the panel lay another cavity, and within it, wrapped in canvas, rested a thick leather-bound book. The air that escaped smelled of soot and cedar, as though time itself had been sealed shut. Reed carried it to the engineer's chair and set it beneath the lamplight. Vesper sniffed once, sneezed, then settled at his feet, eyes fixed. The book was heavier than it appeared, its cover cracked but intact. Reed opened the first page. In elegant fountain pen script, it read, "The Journal of Conductor J.T. Harris, Blue Star Line, 1937 to 1969. Reed turned the pages slowly. The journal was not timetables. It was confession. Harris wrote of the aftermath of the 1937 flood, when desperate families handed over their heirlooms, Bibles, quilts, jewelry, fiddles, believing they would be returned when the waters receded. Bureaucracy failed. Families scattered. The train became keeper of promises too heavy to carry. Harris described nights spent cataloging crates by lamplight, lists made with trembling hands. He confessed to slipping away on his own, tracking down survivors, returning what he could in secrecy. He wrote of trudging up mountain hollows in snow to deliver a carved cradle to a widow who thought it lost forever. Of placing a fiddle in the hands of an old man, fingers shaking as he played one last song. But Harris could not finish the task. Too many items remained unclaimed. His entries grew weary, his script trembling. $50 million in property returned. $137 million yet unreturned. Total entrusted, $187 million. Not treasure, but memory. Not wealth, but obligation. Reed closed his eyes. The weight of those words pressed into him like armor and burden both. He thought of his bank account, the foreclosure notice in his drawer. He had already poured $3,000 into this locomotive, the last of his savings. He had no money, no allies save a librarian, an old mechanic, and an archivist with scars of her own. Vesper rose and padded to him, resting a heavy head on his knee. The dog's amber eyes carried no doubt, only loyalty. "You think we should do it, don't you?" Reed whispered. Vesper's tail tapped once against the steel floor. A quiet, certain yes. Later that day, May climbed into the cab, her hands balancing a thermos of coffee and a bag of biscuits. She perched on the conductor's seat as Reed spread the journal before her. Her eyes widened. She traced the lines with reverent fingers. "This isn't just paper, Reed. These are people's anchors. Quilts stitched by grandmothers. Wedding rings. Family Bibles. They thought they were gone forever." Reed gave a humorless laugh. "And here I am, broke as stone. If I return all this, it doesn't pay the bank. Doesn't stop them from taking my house." May sipped her coffee, considering. Then she glanced at Vesper and smirked. "If you run out of gas, that dog could haul you and the locomotive both. Look at him, he's practically built for it." Reed almost smiled despite himself. May had a way of pulling him back from despair with plain humor, grounding him where grief might have rooted instead. That night, Reed stayed in the cab, pages of the journal spread around him. His father's slip of silver foil returned to mind. Somehow, the old man had known, or guessed, that this mission was waiting for him. But shadows pressed closer. Gus mentioned a stranger loitering near the gate, hat pulled low. Reed noticed a car idling too long across the street before slipping away. Harland Crow's interest wasn't fading, it was sharpening. Reed fetched a camera from his apartment. He photographed every page of the journal, every ledger, numbering the files, saving them to a flash drive labeled in block letters, Archive 1. He locked it in a metal box. If the originals were stolen, memory would survive. 2 days later, Reed drove into the hills. Miller's Gap was circled on Harris's map, and he needed to see it for himself. The road wound narrow between bare trees, their branches rattling like bones in the February wind. He parked at a turnout, binoculars in hand. Vesper leapt from the truck, nose working the air, ears swiveling like radar. From the ridge, Reed scanned the valley below. Near the old trailhead to Miller's Gap stood 2 figures, pretending to smoke but watching the road too carefully. Their jackets were too clean for mountain work, their posture too stiff. One man raised his hand, and Reed saw it bare, no glove. The missing glove lay in Reed's cab, torn by Vesper's teeth. Crow's men were here first. Reed's jaw tightened. He laid a hand on Vesper's neck. The dog bristled, eyes locked on the distant shapes. "Looks like we'll have to move faster," Reed murmured. "Before they strip the bones of history bare." Vesper strained forward, eager, unafraid. Reed felt the old mission pulse stir again, not for war this time, but for remembrance. He turned back toward the truck, determination settling like iron. This wasn't about fortune. It was about finishing a promise left undone. The road to Miller's Gap twisted like a scar through the Blue Ridge Hills. Reed drove an old pickup, Vesper's head thrust out the passenger window, nose twitching at the scents of pine and limestone. In the truck bed, May clutched her oversized satchel stuffed with documents and camera gear, while Gus sat beside her, his tool chest wedged between his boots like an anchor. Behind them, Dr. Eliza Thornton followed in her gray sedan, a notebook open on the passenger seat, pen already poised. By the time they arrived, the day had turned hushed. Miller's Gap had once been a quarry. Now the limestone mouth yawned black, tangled in ivy and bramble. Vesper leapt from the truck first, tail stiff with alertness. He circled the entrance, nose pressed to a thicket of brush. Reed pulled the brush aside, revealing a narrow service tunnel half-collapsed. "It matches Harris's map," he said, holding up the copy. The tunnel sloped low and jagged, damp stone slick beneath their hands. Vesper squeezed through first, sure-footed despite the slope. Reed followed on his knees, the others crawling behind. Their breath fogged in the chill. The space opened into a cavernous chamber. Rows of wooden crates stood in patient order, stacked on stone platforms as though time itself had stood guard. The faint smell of cedar drifted through the air, astonishingly preserved. Reed pried open one lid. Inside lay a silver hairpin wrapped in linen, paired with a yellow ticket stub scrawled with a family's name. Another box revealed a pocket watch, its engraved initials catching the lamplight. A smaller chest held a wooden cross, rough but reverent, tied with a slip of paper in faded ink. "This isn't treasure," May whispered, tears bright in her eyes. "It's people." Eliza moved forward with her usual precision, pulling a portable scanner from her satchel. Her hands were steady, cataloging each artifact, photographing and logging them. Years of scars in academia had taught her to fortify truth with evidence before anyone could deny it. "We'll document everything," she said. "Once the state sees this, they'll have to recognize it as cultural property." Meanwhile, Gus shuffled through his tool chest, hammering together makeshift shelving from reclaimed planks. "Can't have history sitting in damp stone," he muttered, his hands stiff but stubborn. Vesper prowled the perimeter, counting crates with his nose. Then his ears snapped forward. A growl rumbled low in his chest. Footsteps echoed down the tunnel. Lantern beams cut across the chamber. Harland Crow stepped into the cavern, flanked by 2 men in heavy jackets. Despite the mud, he looked immaculate, his slick hair gleaming under the lantern light. In his hand he carried a folded paper, brandishing it like a badge. "Mr. Ashford," he said, his voice smooth as oil. "You and your little committee are trespassing. This site falls under my claim. I have here a state-issued excavation permit. These crates belong to me. May tightened her lips but lifted her phone, recording steadily. Gus spat into the dirt. Harland's men stepped forward, but stopped when Vesper lunged. The German shepherd planted himself squarely in the tunnel's throat, shoulders braced, growl reverberating like thunder. His amber eyes glared, daring them to move. Reed pulled a slim leather folder from his jacket. His voice was firm. That paper's a forgery, Crow. We've got something better. He opened the folder to reveal a brittle county court order dated 1940. It affirmed that the Blue Star Relief property remained in trust until returned to rightful heirs. He had found it in May's archives and brought it deliberately. Eliza stepped forward, her voice crisp and unflinching. And I have digital catalogs ready to upload to the Department of Historic Resources tonight. This site is protected under heritage law. Your permit means nothing. Crow's jaw tightened, his pale gray eyes narrowing. His grip on the forged paper faltered. Before he could respond, tires crunched outside. Flashlights swung into the cavern. State police uniforms flooded in, their beams slicing through the dark. Behind them strode Marjorie Ellis, compact, salt and pepper hair cropped close, her no-nonsense bearing honed by decades in the field. We had reports of unauthorized excavation here, she said flatly, holding out her hand. Mr. Crow, your permit. Harland handed it over. She scanned it once, lips pressing thin. Forgery. She turned to the officers. He's finished. Crow's men shrank beneath Vesper's blazing eyes. They backed toward the exit as the police closed in. Marjorie faced Reed, May, Gus, and Eliza. This site is now under state protection. Thank you for documenting the evidence. From this point on, it will be guarded properly. Reed exhaled at last, tension leaving his shoulders. Vesper relaxed but wagged his tail once, a quiet claim of victory. The cavern of Miller's Gap, after decades of silence, was safe again. Spring sunlight crept gently across Roanoke, a kind of light the town hadn't felt in months. At Delaney Salvage, now fenced and guarded by the state, the forgotten Blue Star 314 no longer sat as a rusting relic. Workers scrubbed and polished her steel. Volunteers swarmed the yard, bringing sawdust, polish, and the faint perfume of oil. Where once there had been only silence, the yard now hummed with purpose. Reed Ashford walked the platform with a clipboard under his arm. He no longer looked like a man teetering on foreclosure. His hair was cut close again, his face shaved clean. The plain denim shirt he wore bore smudges of labor, but his eyes carried something new, steadiness, direction. Beside him padded Vesper, wearing a navy blue scarf embroidered with K-9 Docent. May had insisted the dog deserved official recognition, half practical and half playful. Visitors adored it. During tours, whenever Reed paused by the patched wall where cedar once scented the steel, Vesper would break formation and press his nose to the spot, tail wagging as if sniffing out memory itself. Cameras clicked, children laughed, and even the most serious adults softened. The work of restitution had begun. Dr. Eliza Thornton presided over folding tables lined with boxes, each tagged and catalogued. Her braid was tucked under a protective cap, glasses riding low on her nose as she checked lists with meticulous care. Families trickled in with fragments of hope, and Eliza, stern by habit, softened by purpose, guided them with patience. One afternoon, she matched a hand-stitched quilt to a woman whose grandmother had spoken of it every winter. Another day, she watched a rabbi weep silently as his hands closed over a menorah thought drowned forever. Each reunion was brief but sacred, as though time itself bent to return what it owed. May orchestrated the community side with equal precision. She rallied churches, schools, and heritage groups, weaving them into a network of fundraising and storytelling. Out of her efforts came the Blue Star Heritage Fund, at first just a trickle of small donations, but soon enough to cover Reed's lingering debts. When she handed him the news, her smile was dry and librarian plain. "You've been written out of foreclosure, Mr. Ashford. Consider it a late return fee, paid by the town. Gus Delaney, stubborn as ever, refused to let anyone else handle the locomotive's physical restoration. Arthritis slowed his hands, but not his resolve. He supervised welders and painters, pointing with his wrench like a conductor's baton. Under his guidance, the 314 was sandblasted and repainted in her original navy and silver. Her number gleamed bold again. The long silent bell was polished to a shine. "Steel remembers," Gus muttered to anyone who would listen. "But sometimes you've got to remind it how to shine." Not everyone celebrated. Harland Crow was not finished. He stormed into district court with lawyers at his side, claiming salvage rights through forged documents. For weeks, hearings dragged on. Reed sat stiff in the wood-paneled chamber, his stomach in knots. Crow arrived each time immaculate, his suits pressed, his smirk sharpened. He spoke in rehearsed tones of entitlement, waving paperwork he swore was genuine. But the evidence was heavier than his forgeries. Eliza's catalogs, May's archive scans, and, most damning, the 1940 court order, unmistakably authentic. Even the Federal Art Crime Division weighed in, confirming this was not salvage but cultural property. Witnesses came forward, too. Locals testified about Crow's threats, about the forged permit at Miller's Gap. Under cross-examination, his composure cracked. The judge's gavel struck final. The artifacts belonged under state custodianship, to be returned to rightful heirs. The day he lost, Crow walked out of the courthouse with fury burning in his gray eyes. That evening, he appeared one last time outside the salvage yard, not to fight, but to sneer. He tossed something onto the gravel, a torn leather glove, the same one Vesper had ripped weeks before. His thin smile carried no warmth. "Keep your dog's trophy," he spat, and stalked off. Vesper trotted forward, sniffed the glove, then picked it up gently and carried it to Reed, tail wagging with calm pride. Reed crouched, took it from him, and allowed himself a smile. "Guess we won that round, partner." That weekend, the town gathered at the yard for the rededication of 314. Families who had reclaimed heirlooms arrived dressed in Sunday best. Children darted along the tracks, elders leaned on canes, eyes wet with memory. When the time came, Gus struck the polished bell. Its bronze voice rang clear across the valley, echoing off the blue ridge like the cry of memory itself. The crowd cheered, some laughing, some openly weeping. Reed stood with Vesper at his side, the blue scarf bright against the dog's sable coat. For the first time since war, Reed felt something loosen in his chest. He was not just surviving anymore. He was part of something larger, something healing. The bell tolled again, joyous, and the blue star 314 lived not as a relic, but as a promise kept. The grand opening of the Blue Ridge Memory Center arrived on a Saturday washed in sunlight. From Mill Mountain, the morning rays spilled like shards across the valley. Families poured into the courtyard outside Delaney Salvage, no longer a scrapyard, but a place of witness. Banners fluttered. A brass band played a slow march. And at the heart of it all, the blue star 314 gleamed, polished and proud, a survivor finally invited to tell her story. Inside the hall, reverence mixed with joy. Tables displayed heirlooms reunited with their families, a silver brooch once carried by floodwaters, now resting in the palm of a granddaughter, a quilt stitched generations ago, spread proudly across a chair, a violin lifted to a trembling chin, strings singing for the first time in 80 years. Laughter mingled with tears. It felt less like a museum than a church service, every object preaching a sermon of survival. Reed walked among them quietly, humbled. His denim shirt was pressed for once, his boots shined. He no longer carried the air of a man shadowed by debt, but of someone who had found the right weight to bear. Vesper walked beside him, scarf freshly laundered, ears pricking at every sound. Children flocked to him, giggling when he licked their fingers. Elders nodded gravely, as if he were some guardian saint in sable fur. Every noon, Reed and Vesper made their ritual walk around the 314. Gus Delaney, slower on his feet but glowing with pride, leaned against the railing, spinning tales for the children, how steam engines hissed like dragons, how pistons kicked harder than mules. His voice rasped but never faltered, and the children gathered like disciples. May set up a small stand in the corner, selling postcards of the 314, each stamped with Vesper's paw print in ink. She laughed whenever the dog sniffed her biscuit box first, making sure she wasn't sneaking jelly donuts past him. Security checks thorough, she joked, earning chuckles from passers-by. Eliza Thornton moved through the hall with clipboard in hand, glasses perched low. Years of scars had once made her sharp with suspicion, but here, in this place, she softened. Whenever a family recognized an heirloom in the digital archives and cried out, Eliza stepped back quietly, letting the moment belong to them. Healing crept into her, one story at a time. As dusk fell, lanterns lit the courtyard. Townsfolk gathered for the closing ceremony. At the center stood the polished bell of Blue Star 314. Reed held the rope, Vesper seated at his side, amber eyes glowing with the reflection of every flame. Reed looked out at the crowd, faces old and young, neighbors and strangers now bound by one story. He rested his hand gently on Vesper's neck, feeling the warmth of living trust beneath his palm. His voice carried low but steady. We have returned what was entrusted. Not gold, not fortune, but memory. We gave it back. He pulled the rope. The bell's voice rolled out like thunder braided with light, echoing off the Blue Ridge, rising toward Mill Mountain. And then, as if cued by memory itself, the great neon star crowning the mountain blazed to life. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Some lifted their hands, others bowed their heads. Reed bent down and whispered into Vesper's ear, his voice nearly drowned in the swell of cheers. We gave it back, partner. We did it. Vesper's tail swept once against the ground, a simple, steady affirmation. The wind carried pine and memory through the crowd, wrapping them in something larger than themselves. The star glowed above. The bell rang again. And the story closed not as an ending, but as a beginning, a reminder that what is lost can still be found, and what is found can still be returned. Rust and dust may cover steel. Floods may wash away homes. Years may bury memories. But promises do not die. What Reed and Vesper uncovered was never treasure. It was trust. It was the miracle of restoration, the kind God works quietly in our lives every day. The Blue Star 314 carried forgotten heirlooms back to waiting families, just as the Lord carries our brokenness and restores hope when we least expect it. Life is full of small miller's gaps, moments where we must choose whether to guard what is right or abandon it. Faith asks us to be caretakers of memory, of kindness, of each other. Miracles often don't arrive as blinding light, but as steady devotion, a soldier refusing to sell history, a librarian rallying community, a mechanic teaching steel to shine again, a dog standing guard over what matters most. If you believe God can still bring light into the darkest tunnels and ring bells into silence, share this story. Comment your thoughts, subscribe, and join this journey of hope.